I want to say hello to everyone. My name is Amy Freud, and I'm professor and chair of the history department. And I'm very happy that you've persisted and are staying with us for what is sure to be a very memorable Webb lecture. The history department hosts the Webb lecture annually, and we are very excited to have Maggie Paxson with us today. I have a few things I'd like to share with you as we get started. First of all, I would like to read UMBC's land acknowledgement. UMBC was established upon the land of the Piscataway and the Susquehannock peoples. Over time, citizens of many more indigenous nations have come to reside in this region. We humbly offer our respects to all past, present, and future indigenous people connected to this place. First of all, I want to thank our co-sponsor for today, the Drescher Center for the Humanities. This talk is part of their Humanities Forum series, and there are some other great events coming up later this semester. So to learn more, I encourage you to take a look at dreschercenter.umbc.edu. And I have some pieces of housekeeping. We have real-time captioning available in the right-hand corner via the multimedia viewer. We will be monitoring the chat. However, we ask that you input any questions you have for the speaker into the Q&A module, and we will get to the Q&A session after the talk is over. This talk, as I said, will be recorded and made available on the Drescher Center's YouTube page. You can also connect with the Drescher Center on social media, including Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. And I'd like to invite you to attend the next Humanities Forum event, which is coming up Wednesday, November 11th. It is the Department of Africana Studies 46th Annual W.E.B. Du Bois Lecture. The title is Black COVID Stories, Black Lives Matter and Protest, a conversation with about the ongoing struggle for justice and change. And this is exciting for us. This is a talk by Dr. Carsona K. Wise Whitehead, who of course has her PhD from UMBC. So on to the Webb Lecture. The Webb Lecture is named in honor of our former colleague, Robert K. Webb. Robert Webb was a historian of Britain. He was a chair of our history department. He was a founding member of UMBC. And lastly, he was editor of the American Historical Review. I think Bob would be delighted with today's lecture. And I'm very happy to introduce my colleague, Marilyn Kars, who will introduce our speaker.
Are you going to undo me? Oh, great. Hi, all. My name is Mario Lankars. I am also a member of the history department. Glad that you all made it on. I'm very excited to introduce Maggie Paxson, who's a writer and an anthropologist and a performer. Just to get the credentials out of the way, Maggie holds a bachelor's degree from McGill, and she has a master's of science and a PhD in anthropology from the University of Montreal. Maggie is the author of a critically acclaimed book called The Plateau, which she will hold up for us now because I lent out my copy. It was published in 2019 with Riverhead Books, and it was very widely and favorably reviewed. Oprah's magazine called it radiant, and Kirkus gave it a starred review and described it as, quote, an elegant, intensive study that grapples with an enormous idea, how to be good. In 2020, The Plateau was shortlisted for the American Library in Paris Book Award, and it's the focus of Maggie's talk today. Maggie's also the author of a book called Solovyovo, The Story of Memory in a Russian Village. I do have that book. From 2005, which is a study of magic and ritual and social memory in a northern village in Russia. And Maggie wrote the book as an anthropologist and lived for 2 years in a one-room house with an elderly peasant couple. So Maggie's projects are not for the faint of heart. She's fluent in Russian and in French, and she's worked in rural communities in the Caucasus and upland France, and she has published her work in the Washington Post magazine, in the Wilson Quarterly, in Eon, and various other places. Maggie is also a performer. She sings with the Imperial Palms Orchestra, which is one of the premier East Coast big bands. They focus on music from the 1920s to the 1940s. And at the moment, now with COVID, Maggie has also launched her own series of solo concerts where she sings songs from World War II. And it's a cautious sing-along participatory event that she calls the Bomb Shelter Cafe. I have hosted one in my backyard, and it was wonderful. Maggie lives in DC with her husband, writer and historian Charles King. And I don't think that the history department has ever had a lecturer who both spoke and sang. So we're in for a real treat today. Maggie is going to speak for about 20-25 minutes, then she'll sing a song, then we'll have questions and answers, and then she'll sing some more for you. So please join me in waving your hands to welcome Maggie Paxson, who will share with us a French village, its legacy of rescue, and lessons for a troubled time.
Oh, thank you so much. Thank you, Marie-Elaine. Thank you, Courtney. Thank you, Amy. And also, if you're out there, Professor Van, whose class I got to speak with a couple of days ago, students asked wonderful questions. It was really a thrill. I'm really honored to be here for this lecture in this name. And as I was saying earlier, the programs that you have at UMBC are so marvelous and really inspiring. And so I'm all the more inspired to be here today with you. So there are a lot of ways that I can talk about this book that I wrote and this place that I got to write about. But today I'm going to start with something sort of simple, which is that years ago, I learned about an extraordinary place. And this place was a tiny plateau in South Central France, where a community came together during a terrible time, the Second World War, the Holocaust, to do good. What more specifically did they do? For years, mostly from 1940 to 1945, they sheltered hundreds, if not thousands, of people from the Nazis, and thereby saved hundreds, if not thousands, of lives. The people that they sheltered were mostly children, mostly Jewish children, but they were not only Jewish children, and they were not only Jewish, they were from all walks of life. Many of them were political refugees, religious refugees, economic refugees. So this community, what did they do? They fed these people, they clothed them, they hid them from raids, from police raids. They procured and distributed false documents for them. They housed them, they schooled the children, and they shuttled them to safety, most often in Switzerland. And this they did at great risk to their own lives. And in certain cases, their lives were lost in this effort. So just a couple of specifics to remember about the context before I move on, because as Marie-Elaine was saying, I'm an anthropologist and I'm not a historian, but nevertheless, some bits of the context are important. In the 1930s, as we know, there was a worldwide, so the period that just preceded this period, there was a worldwide economic depression. People were living under strained economic circumstances. There was increasing turmoil between the political left and right. There was the Spanish Civil War that caused great turmoil in Europe. Importantly, also, refugees were everywhere. Refugees were the European continent was on the move, but not just the European continent. There were economic refugees, political refugees, and ideological refugees, and they were moving, and they weren't home, and they were scared. This was also, of course, the time of the rise of Nazi Germany, the rise of anti-Semitic ideas, but also laws and specific, very frightening persecutions. On September 1st, 1939, Nazi Germany invaded Poland. In the spring of 1940, Nazi Germany occupied northern France. France is where our story takes place. At that time, France was half occupied and in the north, and in the south, there was a collaborationist regime set up called Vichy. But by November of 1942, the southern part of France was also occupied. And so the entire country was inside of this ecosystem of occupation and war. It's also important to say that in France had its own concentration camps. Not everyone knows this. It had its own anti-Semitic laws. It had an entire population really trying to figure out how to manage in these really quite frightening and deadly circumstances. That often meant that those regular French citizens with German occupiers were trying to make do, trying to live with the pressures around them, and trying to manage the kind of the terror of the moment. And often that meant giving in. So in this context, I wrote a story about a little plateau, again in the south of France, that acted differently, that took people in instead of turning them in to the authorities, and that gave up their meager resources in these troubled times to feed strangers. Again, for this, many of them risked their lives, and some of them lost their lives. So this obviously is an extraordinary place and is morally very special. It is a morally special place. And any of you who have studied the Holocaust or studied the Second World War or even been to the Holocaust Museum, you can have a sense of how rare this was. And we don't have to get into this now. If there are some questions about this, we can talk about this later. But let's just say for now that it's so rare that only two communities have been honored in Israel by Yad Vashem. Collectively, the whole community was honored. And dozens of people who lived in this tiny plateau were named by Israel as righteous among the nations. So morally, we know that it was very rare and very special. But I'm a social scientist. So when I learned about this story, this morally extraordinary story, which, by the way, there have been books about, there have been several historical books by theologians, ethicists, people trying to grapple with this extraordinary moral moment. I'm an anthropologist, so I wanted to understand also other things. What was special about this socially? So this place, I can just give you some big ideas, and then later maybe we can talk about it. But one thing that was very special for me as an anthropologist was that normally when you think about people risking something to do something good, altruistic or good, you think of an individual person. In this case, the people doing the rescue were a group. It was coordinated. It wasn't just one person having to decide in a moment to do a risky thing. It was a community having to decide to do a risky thing. That's special socially. Also, oftentimes historians and others think of, when you see an extraordinary action, you think of the person behind the action, right? The charismatic person who might have been in charge and leading people to do these sorts of things. And there were such people. There were pastors who were really active, politicians, local actors who were really extraordinary and charismatic. But this was also a case where very, very importantly, regular old people were doing most of this work, right? People who were farmers, people who were tradesmen. Most of it was women, actually, who were doing this work. Men were often absent. Regular people were doing. That's socially significant, right? Also, it wasn't just that this one group of regular people came together in one shot and did a thing, which happened sometimes during these terrible years in the Holocaust. This was these people doing this thing basically every day for years, right? You have to have a kind of a practice that's different when you do it once only or when you do it over years. It's a different kind of thing. It's socially interesting. Also, I'm not a political scientist, but I have one at home, my husband, Charles King. We don't talk so much about this, but in political science, there's a thing called rational choice. And that is the almost religious idea that people will act, that you can basically bet on the fact, if you're trying to analyze societies, that most of the time people will act in their own best interest. Here, And depending on how you define one's best interest, they did not. They put themselves at risk. So in a way, if you see it as kind of like, normally we act for ourselves, we're not acting for ourselves. That's not, by this system, logical. It doesn't work. So that's special. That's socially special. Finally, something socially unique and special. And once I started digging into the story, I learned more about this, was that this was not the first time this tiny plateau and this tiny community sheltered vulnerable people from danger. Way back in the 16th century, during the great religious wars between Protestants and Catholics in much of Europe, this community, which had a sort of oversized Protestant community, sheltered Protestants and helped them to escape from those wars. Later, during the French Revolution, they sheltered Catholics, the same Catholic priests that hundreds of years earlier might have been the target, the people who would have hurt them themselves. They sheltered them and shuttled them out to safety. In the 19th century, there were 19th century versions of fresh air programs where they brought children from industrial centers up into this little plateau for summers to take care of them, children from vulnerable families, children where they might have been unsafe at home. They also started paying attention to Algerian folks who had been coming into the country and who were in need. In the 20th century, in the 1920s, 30s, the Spanish Civil War hit, Spanish women and children were coming and finding their way to this plateau. And then in the Second World War, this happened. So this is also significant. This is something meaningful. This is, for social scientists, we see something that looks like a habit, right? That it looks like something that people know how to do, and they do it again. Now, that has a lot of dimensions to it, but it's very, it's significant and interesting. So what did I do with this? And I could back up a little bit. I'm an anthropologist, as I said. So basically, I spent the whole of my career as an anthropologist studying rural communities far away from the center of power. And I studied a thing that I would call, or folks would call, social memory. And what that really meant in my case was like how practices had a kind of a stability to them, how things didn't want to change sometimes. Sometimes you don't want them to change and they didn't change, and sometimes you didn't want them to change and they didn't change. But basically, I wanted to understand in this rural community, if a state wants you to be something, let's say the Russian state or the Soviet state, if it wants you to be a certain way, be a kind of a person, change your economy, change your religion, change your daily economy, can it do that? And the short answer that I learned was that not as much as it thinks it can, right? It's not as powerful in some ways for communities far from the center of power to change all that it thinks it can change. So when I learned and started studying the story of the plateau, I realized that here was a question that was very familiar to me, but with a twist. In other words, what about this situation in this plateau was about the persistence of social forms when you have the pressure of a state to try to change you? I conceptualized it kind of like this. If a community is kind of a circle, right? The state tries to kind of press in on that circle and get people to do stuff. Also, in that circle, when the state is kind of pressing in on people to try to do things, when you're in that circle, your instinct is to close yourself up and protect yourself, right? I conceptualized it like this. You want to protect yourself when you're in danger. But here was a community that in danger, rather than closing itself to the world, opened itself to the world, right? And how could I understand this? This I started seeing as resistance also. It's a form of resistance. The state's telling you to turn in those awful refugees who are going to hurt you, right? You don't do it, right? The state is telling you to hate strangers. You don't do it, right? This is resistance. And you do it not only just out of a kind of an easy habit, but you do it at risk to your life. So something is animating that. So I came up with a couple of questions that were social sciencey questions. And they sounded something like this. There are communities in this world that actively resist violence during violent times. What makes them do this? And another question. Are there, over the long term, social practices that can combine to support and reproduce this kind of resistance? But I also learned how to put it another way as I got going, and that was this. What could this tiny plateau in the middle of France tell me about and teach me about how to be good when it's hard to be good? So I went to this plateau, and I took all the train journeys and the bus journeys, and I made my way there. And I got to know the community. And almost one of the first things that I learned when I got there was that there are, in fact, refugees living there today. And that was for me an utterly, I mean, I shouldn't have been surprised, but I almost couldn't believe my eyes when I heard about it. They were there often under the auspices, although that changed and broadened, under a welcoming center for asylum seekers. But there they were, these people from all over the world, in various countries, living there, being strangers, having escaped all kinds of things. There were people from Congo, Rwanda, Guinea, all over Eastern Europe. There are people from Armenia, Azerbaijan, Georgia, and the Russian North Caucasus, where, by the way, I had just been doing field research. I can say also that as the years progressed, as I kept going back to the plateau, they were also from Syria, from Yemen. There were people who had arrived at great peril to their lives on rafts over the Mediterranean Sea from various countries in Africa. How are those people treated now? I now got to ask that question. It wasn't just theory. I was there in the middle of this situation where people were escaping great harm in their own lives, the risk of death, the risk of all kinds of violence. And how are they treated there now? And so there are a lot of things that I could talk about, and I think in the comments, in the questions, we can talk about some specifics, but the short of it is with great kindness, and also with time and resources and energy and sometimes money, and sometimes having people come and live with them in their homes, sight unseen. So what are some lessons that I got? Some brief lessons were this. First of all, this community had an idea at the heart of itself, which was that when they were asked during the war, what about these Jews that you're taking in? They would say, and there's a book actually named after this quote by the wonderful Patrick Henry, we don't know Jews, we only know people. So they showed a habit of not focusing
Have we lost Maggie for a sec?
we don't know.
Because it's that kind of lecture. Maggie, you were gone a little bit.
Okay, can you see me now?
Yes.
Yes, and we can hear you too.
Okay, good. So one of the first lesson was we don't know Jews, we only know human beings. In other words, when you're not seeing the specific stories. Can you
Maggie,
see me
you're
now?
breaking up again.
You guys are going away. Am I still there?
Yeah, you were breaking up.
Okay.
There must be something the matter with your internet.
Okay, I hope not. Let's see how long we can make this work.
You're okay now.
Aside from this lack of focus on, okay, I'm okay? This lack of focus on specific identities was silence, the power of silence. They didn't like to talk about the good things that their grandparents had done in the past. They didn't like to talk about the good things that they did today. This made research a little bit complicated because I actually wanted to hear their stories. But But I came to understand that not talking about a thing in a way might be part of the dynamic of not focusing on one's grandeur and one's good deeds, one's goodliness, that might actually not just be a moral thing, but a social thing. You do a thing, you forget it. Another thing I learned was about the specific meaning of children in the community. And I could get into this during the questions, but children, the refugees would come as families, and their children would go to school, and their children would become friends with French children. And the next thing you know, they would be in each other's homes, and there would be a bridge. This is an insight that was given to me by the wonderful historian Gérard Bollon, who said, look out for this. Look for this fact that the community is coming together that way, that children play this role. Another thing I learned, one of the first things that a tourist might see if they go to the Plateau Vivarais-Lignon and the village where I lived in this plateau called Le Chambon-sur-Lignon is a church. And it is a Protestant church. And on that church, it's just basically 4 walls, a roof, a top, and then the words that are written. Just this one phrase, aimez-vous les uns les autres, love one another. So that is a beautiful thing to see in a church. It's a beautiful thing to see as the only words in a church. It certainly for me is a beautiful thing, given that it seems to be, to me, the animating force of all the religions that I know, that you have these words at the heart of things. But it struck me, what if love isn't just an emotion? What if it isn't just a part of theologies? What if it's also an action, a social action? How could you trace it? What does it mean? And I can say, in action was everywhere. So I'd like to talk about one little more thing before we come to the questions, and that is a surprise that I had while I was working. When I began this project, study this village, because I'm an anthropologist and I know how to study villages and I know how to study resistance and I wanted to study good and goodness, I tried to ignore the fact that I had a family connection to this story, because I thought that social science didn't care about the connections that I had to the story. I found it a little embarrassing to mention it, but nevertheless, I kept it in mind. So what was that family connection? It was a distant one. When I was growing up, there was my great-grandfather was very old, and he had a wife, a second wife, who was a bit younger than he was, and she was French. And I remember that she was French, and I thought that was very exotic and wonderful. And my mother, who's Jewish, told me, Susie, her name was Susie, Susie's family was in the French Resistance. Well, I grew up in Rochester, New York. For me, nothing sounded more exotic than the French Resistance when I was growing up, but I didn't really have a sense of what that meant. So years later, I went to the Holocaust Museum and I saw an exhibit about the Plateau Vivarais-Lignon, this plateau that I ended up writing about. And there in the exhibit, I saw Susie's last name. And the name was this, Trocmé. So for those of you who've been to the Holocaust Museum, you might recall that there was a pastor named André Trocmé, who was very important in this story. He was a charismatic, full of life, defiant pastor who was going to use, as he said, the weapons of the spirit to resist the violence of the Nazi occupation. This wasn't my family connection, was Andre, but much more closely, it was Susie's little brother. And Susie's little brother was also in this exhibit. I learned years later. Honestly, I did not know when I first saw what this connection was. It was just the same last name. But I learned that in 1912, a boy was born named Daniel. He was born to a family of prominent educators in the north of France. In the 1920s, he had the best education that you could possibly have in that country. Went to the best schools. His family was prominent, religious, storied in France. They were Protestants. Some questions about his life, about his family, about how it all worked. And he traveled. He started to travel. And he got educated in the sciences and physics, and he went to Beirut to teach. And there he lived in the Middle East for a while. And he started writing curious letters home to his family. He said, I'm realizing that there is not just one civilization, but there are many civilizations. Maybe a shocking thing to some prominent parents at home. He also wrote a letter that said, I can now see what is beautiful and good in Christianity, but also what is ugly and false. He began to have friends who were Jews, who were Muslims, who were not religious. He began to question the politics that was all around him all the time. He wrote to his parents, don't think I'm just of the left, but I don't know. I don't know about this bourgeoisie. I don't know. He was a seeker. So in September of 1940, the war started. His parents did their best to be resistors. This young man got an invitation from his cousin, Andre Trocmé, the pastor. He said, the pastor said, we need help here in this plateau in Le Chambon-sur-Lignon. We need help. Can you come and help us? You've worked with kids before. Can you come and help us? And he weighed the possibilities. He had wanted to get a PhD. He'd had a job offer in Barcelona. But he weighed it. This was going to be in the middle of nowhere, right? He had a girlfriend he had to leave behind. He weighed it, and he wrote his letter to his mother on September 11th, 1942, and he said, the die is cast. I've decided I'm going to go. I'm going to go to this plateau. I want to be part of this. And he said, I'm going, and it will be an adventure, but it's not for an adventure that I go. I go because I want to be part of the reconstruction of the world. Which is wonderful because it echoes for, if there are Jewish people out there, they know reconstruction of the world is tikkun olam in Judaism. I want to be part of the reconstruction of the world. And he said, I also go because I don't want to be ashamed of myself. So he went. He went to the plateau. He was the director of first one home for children where they were doing all this caretaking of children, little refugees who were experiencing the worst you can imagine. And then he started becoming the director of a home for young men as well. And in June of 1943, there was the first successful raid of the Germans into this plateau. And he was scooped up with 18 young men, sent to prison in Moulins in France, then to a concentration camp in Germany, and finally to Majdanek, the extermination camp, where he perished. So I wrote this book. I started to see this person as important, not because of our distant family connection so much, although I have to say it was very touching to me, but that this young man, somehow I understood him. He was a seeker. He wanted to be good. He wanted to live a good life. He was thirsty for the right choices. And he went there to this place to learn from these people. And I started to think more and more that he went to the plateau and I followed him. And more I wanted the reader to follow me. And he left me with personal questions, I think. If in some ways I started out as an anthropologist and I was confident in my methods and I know how to write books, I started out confident that I could do this as an anthropologist. More and more, I became haunted with the personal questions about what it would mean to face the decisions that he faced. And I should say, at the raid, he could have easily escaped. He could have jumped out a window and gone into the forest, as a lot of people were doing. And he did not. He chose to be arrested so that he could make sure that the young men were taken care of properly. I kept thinking then, what if it was me? What if it was now? Would I know how to be good when it's hard to be good? And that caused me to start thinking more and more, it's not like there's a sign in the sky that reads, beware, because you're living in terrible times. The future will judge you by what you do right now. We don't get that sign in the sky. So we have to go through these questions and take them very seriously. Because I, for one, would like not to be considered by the future a barbarian. So I think that I'll end basically here, my comments, but I will say this. This plateau had a lot to teach me. And, when I started out, and I write this in the beginning of the book, you could say, like, people say, well, what do they know? What's the magic there? Why are they so good? And I would say to myself, it's not magic. It can't be magic. It's not like there's something in the water that changes people. And, the book is a story of going through these sorts of things that aren't magical. But in a way, I came to believe in a kind of an alchemy. And that alchemy depended on this, that these people somehow embraced the fundamental notion of the oneness of humanity, and they lived it. And through that notion of the fundamental oneness of humanity, the friend. That's the magic. How to do that, how to look at a stranger, and in a way, fall in love. So I'm going to leave it there for now, but maybe there'll be questions at some point and we can touch on some of the other things.
Did you want to sing a song, Maggie? I thought you were going to do a song for us at the end.
Yes, okay.
And then we will have questions.
Absolutely. So I'm
and
going to
then more singing.
A sip of water. So the music. This might be absurd, but I'm doing it anyway. So I do have this second life as a singer, and the music that I play in my band, usually the big band, the Imperial Palms Orchestra, and now just with my ukulele because musicians aren't playing. In the time that I was working on the book, the songs from my band, the songs that I love from this period of the 1920s, 30s, and 40s, started being a way for me to connect with this period and have empathy in a way with what people were like back then. So I'm going to do one of the songs that actually was very special to me because, and some of you might actually know it, Billie Holiday made it famous in 1944. It was written in 1938. But I remember I was learning it and recording it in one of the chapters. I think it might have actually been the chapter that I had to write with my Daniel, when he was arrested. And I took it to heart, this moment. It was very hard. And so this is a song called I'll Be Seeing You. You can sing along, I won't hear you. I wish I could. I'll be seeing you in all the old familiar places that this heart of mine embraces all day through. In that small cafe there, park across the way there, children's carousel, the chestnut tree, the wishing well. I'll be seeing you in every lovely summer's day, in everything that's light and gay. I'll always think of you that way. I'll find you in the morning sun, and when the night is new, I'll be looking at the moon, seeing you.
Thank you. Thanks, Maggie. That was great. And it fits exactly with a question that one of our faculty members asked, actually, who is a public historian, Denise Maringolo. And she's saying, as a public historian, I often center emotion and think about how emotions act in particular situations. If I'm honest, she says, I do this somewhat intuitively. It's just who I am. Can you talk about methodologies for the consideration of emotion?
Oh my God. So I don't know if he's here, if John Levitt, my dissertation advisor, is in the audience. I know he shared this event, but my dissertation advisor, John Levitt, works on this. Actually, there are ways of approaching sort of the social science of emotion. It depends on what kind of object like the thing, how can I put this? Is it attached to ideas? And then there's a pretty straightforward way of doing that. Because the kind of anthropologist I am, I rely on seeing how people see things, how they conceptualize things, but it's not like an equation the way I see it. So it's not like they have an idea and then they live by that idea. It's rather they have an idea and then there are all these feelings that kind of associate with and attach to that idea. And those feelings can be attached to other things. So I can say, yes, there are methodologies. I rely on those methodologies in my own work as an anthropologist. I have relied on them a lot. But I will say that in the case of this book, what happened to me as a human being was that even the good theories that I knew, the work that I had, then the way I knew how to analyze it, I was overwhelmed actually by the stories, not only from that came out of the Second World War, but the refugees of today who are living these things now. And I think it was the largeness of emotions in some ways that forced me to kind of abandon some of the method that for a time anyway, the method that I had grown accustomed to as an anthropologist, and start opening myself up more widely. And the book, for anyone who's read it, it actually is a kind of a conversation between, what is science and what is the soul. I changed in the course of writing it. I'm a shy person. I didn't particularly want to write stuff a lot about my own story, but I ended up writing more about my own story because I wanted the largeness of those things to be able to talk to each other. And I wanted the reader, hopefully, to be able to come with me and ask themselves about their own large things. So, I didn't want to get technical in the social science part, but absolutely there are ways. And I think actually it's very important in social science to account for, to be able to talk about not just how people think about things, but how they feel about things. They're related. But oftentimes we find that the feelings about things are the propulsion towards action in ways that the thoughts about things aren't the propulsion towards action. So hopefully that was a little bit of a dabble in that. So.
Okay. I want to say, by the way, that if people have questions, please put them in the chat and we'll take them. There is a question here. Okay, so let's see. The question is, you have not touched on explanations as to what makes this community so helpful and philanthropic. Is it hereditary, the local water, or perhaps a sense of historical identity? This is who we are. Can you offer some of your explanations?
Well, yeah, I was kind of yes, thank you. That is the sort of the heart of the question for the social sciences. And I was sort of touching on them in a maybe more lyrical way when I was speaking just now. No, there's no magic, right? No, you don't get, it's not magic. I mean, I know it's not in the water. I know you don't think it's in the water, but there are things that you can learn that are like, for example, when political scientists look at places that are good at resisting, right? There are characteristics, like one of the characteristics has to do with being a Highlander, for example, like to be in the mountains. They're in the mountains. So there they are, being in the mountains, resisting, right? Are they resisting in such a way that you like it or that you don't like it? Like that doesn't answer kind of the moral question. People have proposed that it's because they're religious, they're Protestant, right? That was another thing that they were. And that's sort of a discussion that's sort of in these kinds of literatures, but being Protestant alone, and by the way, only a portion of the people are Protestant. Being Protestant alone you can't use that as an explanation for generic goodness, because other Protestants were doing the same things during the war, right? So it's not, it doesn't work. Being religious, again, you had plenty of were doing these things, right? So religion alone can't explain it. There are things that are in sort of social psychology. There are theories about people who are liminal to society, right? People who are away from the center of things, right? So including people, who are not in power, maybe who are looked down upon in society for whatever reason, sometimes criminals, right? sometimes, outsiders in other ways, that they are overrepresented among what they call heroic altruists. So people who don't depend on things looking like being inside of things and having everyone agree that they're great and like they're not attached to their status, right? So prostitutes overrepresented, right? Sex workers are overrepresented among people who do good things in these places. So in a way, I think it's a little of everything. And where I did sort of abandon the idea of religion per se as being a cause, I did think, and I came to believe, and I think in the journey of the book, you see this, there is something that people do seem to share, which is that there is something that they believe is more than themselves, right? That maybe they have vis-a-vis that thing, that greater thing matters more, right? So how do you attach yourself to a greater thing that matters more? Do you need religion to do it? No. Does it help? Maybe. But the core, because as I say earlier in the book, sometimes religion makes you better than you would be without it, and sometimes it makes you worse. But that thing of being able to kind of embrace this idea of something greater than you are and attach it to that loving kindness, right? That means that your actions can be, even if a bad thing happens to you and you suffer, it still it's okay still, right? So that's a big thing, but that isn't easy to write in an equation, right? So you really, in this question, you really get to the heart of some of the stuff that I'm trying to dig through in the book. I will say that I did conclude that there isn't any community by itself that is angelic. You become angelic by doing good, right? You don't become angelic by being an angel, right? Same with people. There's no kind of person. There's no ethnic group. There's no countrymen. There's no religion. That makes you good all by itself. It's the act of loving, the act of being good, right? That makes you good, right? That makes you saintly. So
there was Maggie. There are so many questions. Go ahead, Courtney.
So there's a question from Austin Edelenbos, which is, what were the major bases of sources you used to research and write this book?
Oh, thank you for this question. I wish I could see people's faces. So just know, I'm imagining your beautiful faces. I can't see them, but I'm imagining them. So the history part, I have a person who knows how to write history at home. I'm an anthropologist. I know, I had to learn basically how to use historical sources, and that was extraordinary and hard and amazing. So I did have the very first resources that I used were available at the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum here in Washington, D.C., which was the Visual History Archives. So what that was interviews with people who had lived through the war, right? And I could, through those interviews, there was a small number of survivors who had lived through, they had survived in the war in the Plateau. One of them I now know, and he's important in my story. His name is Peter Feigl, and I adore him and love him, and he's in the book. But so I'm an anthropologist, so the interviews felt really, really important. But also there are all kinds of archives there that you could reach. The International Tracing Service, which was the kind of the way that mostly Jewish people at first tried to collect information about their loved ones after the Holocaust, how they could find them. So these documents now are more and more they're easier and easier to handle, even though they're still really, really, really hard. But I was able to follow the stories of a lot of the people. Like I tried my hardest. Like I fell in love with my Daniel Chokmeh, but also with the children he was taking care of, and I wanted to find them. And sometimes they were quote unquote lost without a trace, and then I would find them, and it was amazing. So the International Tracing Service, also Daniel Chokmeh was named by Yad Vashem as righteous among the nations. And because of my family connection, I believe, to this story, I was allowed to see his file, which was, I think, 70 some pages long, something like that, which had letters from people who had seen him in his work in the Plateau, in prison, in Buchenwald, who had seen him and talked to him. And also, maybe most precious of all, there were these letters that the family made available that he'd written. Some of them went in as a young man in the 30s. So that's why I know about him, having this extraordinary period. Also from prison and the concentration camps. So I really was very and then if you read the book, this then won't be a surprise, but I got this pile of letters, right? When I was finishing writing the book, from my aunt, Barbara, who said, oh, we have these letters from Grandma saved them. They're of, Susie, Daniel's beloved sister, writing back and forth to my grandmother and telling the story of Daniel in those letters. It was amazing. So yeah, so some of that was luck. Some of that was just the Holocaust Museum, by the way, their archivists, their librarians are so amazing. So, I totally, totally recommend. They're so kind and so helpful. And they were really that with me. So.
Great. Thank you, Maggie. Here's a question from a student who asks, let's see, were there any parts of the research that were difficult to come to grips with in terms of what you were studying? What kind of challenges did you come across in your research?
Well, I was mentioning this earlier. It's very hard if you're an anthropologist and you depend on and you believe that the source of things for you is people talking to you, and they won't talk to you about the exact thing that you want to hear about. But I kind of loved it at the same time because it said something to me about who they were. And so it was kind of like a difficult thing that turned into a positive thing, that I learned that, okay, if you ask people to tell you about their, grandmother's story and they don't want to tell you, watch them, don't push it. If you want, I stopped wanting to ask refugees. I was at a certain point, I was like, I'm not going to ask stuff anymore. I'm just going to see what comes. And that for this project was wise. It was wiser. It was more helpful. It was also just plain an extremely painful and difficult subject, right? To not only be looking at the Holocaust story, but also, and, spending a lot of time at the Holocaust Museum. I was a fellow there for a time at the Mandel Center, and spending a lot of time there with these, basically the worst of our stories, collected in one spot, and the worst of what we're capable of, but also then to realize that, I was there when, the Syrian refugees, these poor people were, coming into Europe desperate, right? All of these people right now, today, and when you get close to these people, it so happened that in the case of some of these refugees, I spoke Russian. So I could talk to them in ways that the French folks, local folks, couldn't talk to them. So I was hearing these stories and they were devastating, right? So that's not exactly what you're asking, but I think it is true that, these are tough subjects, right? And, and being ready to say, oh my God, what if it's now? What if it's me? To ask those hard questions was very, very hard. But I think, in these times we're living in, I think it's not a bad thing to do, right? For all of us to figure out in a way, okay, there are storms afoot. The world is strange and crazy. What is my true north, right? How do you be a strong ship in the storm, right? And so I think we can't really do that if we don't look into ourselves. So I think that was what I tried to do.
And I would like to add to that, if I may, Courtney, that Maggie's book is not only the history of this village, but it's also the history of her own journey to do the research and to be in the village and then to write it up. So the question that was just asked is actually answered quite extensively in the book itself.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Courtney. Sorry.
We have a question. How do people decide to use history to define their identity? Do they discard the bad and forget things from the national past that might reflect poorly, such as deniers of the Holocaust, debate of history, for example? Sorry if I mispronounced that.
Oh, I missed the very beginning of the question. It was, can you repeat the beginning of it? Sorry about that, Courtney.
How do people decide to use history to define their identity? Do
Oh,
they discard the bad and forget things from the national past that might reflect poorly?
absolutely. So, right. That's another topic that you hit the nail on the head with that question, because it is so important, I think, when we are sort of orienting ourselves as social beings, like, look at my team, my nation, my people. We're so great. Look what we did, right? Look what we did in the past, and we forget the bad things, right? So it's that thing is so easy to do. My family, my team, my city, my country, my kind, right? It's so easy because we love these people and they're fuzzy to us. We want them to be good. And, so often what lies at the heart of nationalist movements is exactly that. And so that comes up a lot in the book, to interrogate that in ourselves. As my husband says, you should be suspicious of any ideological system where your folks happen to end up on the top ladder, right? On the top of it. You might want to question, when you kind of think your folks are the best, you might want to question that thing. But I think it is such an important, animating force about sort of underneath a lot of the social problems that we have right now. The contention is that people go around silently believing the goodness of their kind and the not quite so goodness of other kinds, or maybe the badness or the evil or the unhumanness, right, of the other kind, right? And it's a thing to interrogate in oneself too. I think it's pretty easy to sneak in there. Yeah.
We have 2 more questions in the chat, in the Q&A.
Well, Courtney, can I interrupt 1 second? Because I'm wondering, I don't know until we want to go, whether we would like for Maggie to answer a couple more questions, or whether we would like to hear her sing. So maybe Amy can weigh in.
I'd like a song.
I mean, or maybe Maggie, who seems to have frozen at the moment, we could ask her to answer 1 more question and then sing a last song.
Well, we have 2 more questions, and they've been in there for a while, so let's do those 2.
Not everybody gets to ask their question.
Well, some questions were skipped over.
Yeah. That's always true, when people raise their hands too.
It seems like Maggie is having like
that may solve our dilemma here.
Yeah.
I think Maggie's probably trying to come back on. Okay. I see that some people would like more questions. So let's do the 2 questions.
Okay. Yeah, once Maggie's able to rejoin us, then we will do those. It seems like she's having low bandwidth issues, so it might be something on her end.
In the meantime, Dr. Freud put a link to Maggie's book in the chat if anybody would like to see the full title, in case they would like to borrow it from the library or get a copy for themselves.
And
Hello, can you see me?
There's Maggie.
Yes, you're back, Maggie.
Yes.
Hello?
We decided, meanwhile, can you hear
I'm
us?
so terribly sorry. Yes, I'm
That we would
terribly sorry.
that we would ask you a few more questions.
Okay.
So,
Very good.
Courtney, go ahead.
Well, I just had a note just for those who are still with us, and if you had any colleagues or friends who were unable to enter into the event. The event is recorded and will be put online on our YouTube page. So after the event, we will, an email will come out to you sometime tomorrow with the link.
Okay.
All right, so a question from Patrick. Can you elaborate more on how you conceptualize resistance from this very positive example of resisting for others, not for the self?
Okay, that's a great question too. I mean, I'm very generic about things like that. I think in some ways, like in a way, more like a mathematician. Or at least I amuse myself with that idea. You know, resistance is like when there's a pressure to do a thing and you don't want to do it, right? So sometimes that resistance can look like a benign state wanting people to, let's say, use electricity or something like that, and it might look like something totally benign, and you say, I don't want to do it, or let's send your kids to school. No, I'm a resistor, right? I'm not going to send my kids to school. Sometimes it looks benign and you resist, like a kid, like you have a kid, you tell the kids bedtime. No, I resist. I'm not going to bed. So it might be a positive impulse, right? But people still say no, right? Sometimes it looks like this, like there's an outside influence that makes you want to do a bad thing, right? It is pressuring you to be something that you're not, that you feel is wrong, and you still say no. Some of this, in a way, it's kind of existential, because how do you decide who's the benign force, right? Asking you to do a thing. You know, your mom wants you to go to bed, or the state is only really just asking you to tell on people when they're kind of undesirable, like that idea, right? Or when the state is telling you to turn on people and they're bad, right? To do that. So, you know, this is why also, you know, you can resist, you can be a Highlander and resist, and it looks romantic and great, or you can be a Highlander and resist, and you can look like a marauder, right? Depending on the story and how it's told. All the more reason why in the course of this journey of this book, right, I felt it was important to take on these existential issues. Wait, what? Who? Like, do I have to be, who is the benign and good, you know, person telling me to do something, or people? And who is the dangerous one that I need to look out for, right? And how can I find that answer, right, in myself, right? So, you know, I'm not giving you a very technical answer, but I think, yeah, there's a lot of positioning in that resistance, right? Like sometimes it looks good, sometimes it looks bad. How do we know? Well, we have minds and hearts and the ability to analyze the world. We have gorgeous rational capacities, and they're hopefully attached to, you know, our hearts. And that's kind of the way through, in effect. So.
Okay, and then there's one more question from Fan Yang, who's a professor in media and communication studies at UMBC. She asks, could you talk more about the geographical surrounding of the village and whether that material environment played a role in shaping their sensibilities?
Yeah. Thank you for the question. Yeah, I mean, I always, like, if I could, in a way, I would linger on this point in talks, because it really is such a beautifully situated place. It's in South Central France. It's on the border of Haute-Loire and Ardèche, which are two départements. Basically, the nearest, when I would arrive in Paris in the morning, I would take a train to Lyon, and then another sort of commuter train to Saint-Étienne, an industrial city, sort of a really kind of important industrial city, and then take a bus up to the plateau. So it is this sort of, it's kind of like a little bowl of a plateau, larger plateau called Massif Central. That is, you know, by France's standards, a very uninhabited kind of area. Still, it's not like Canada or something, or Russia where I lived. I mean, there's still people everywhere, but it's a lesser traveled, less well-known place. So in the plateau, you're surrounded by, you know, rocks and hills and moss and pine trees. And in the winter, it snows like crazy. It's quite cold. It's gorgeous. So it's absolutely gorgeous. But yes, so the materiality of it did matter, right? Because it was hard to get to, right? You know, it was hard to get to always, but during the Second World War, when you're trying, Germany's it was really stretched thin. It was trying to occupy a lot of countries and trying to get on top of a lot of, administrations and things. It's hard to get to. I mean, it's the kind of hard to get to so that in the winter you can't get up the roads, in the winter and for weeks on end at that time. So yeah, that made it relatively safe actually for these refugees, especially in certain periods, that the snow, the being up high, the being far away. And that, again, that kind of goes with, like, it's easier to resist if you're hard to get to, right? Then if the state can't reach you, it's easier to resist. So, but again, it's also, I fell in love with the place. First of all, the people are absolutely gorgeous and beautiful souled, but also it is so beautiful there. So beautiful. Woods surround, extraordinary. So
Courtney, there's one more person who asked a question at 5:04. So, and it's our new Russian historian. So I thought I should ask it, and now I just unfortunately scrolled it away. And it's a question about the power of memory. Okay. And Miriam is asking, my initial assumption would have been that knowledge of the actions of the ancestors would also exert an influence on later generations, in the sense of wanting to honor their ancestors by following in their footsteps and living up to their standards. Do you want to speak to that?
So actually, yes, and I apologize to the person who sort of asked a question that resonates with this one a bit earlier. So does the memory of the thing, I mean, you're speaking more poetically about ancestors, and not just poetically, but truly about people who came before. But somehow does that memory of activities matter? And I think the short answer is yes, but it depends how, right? So there are people who live there, who know the stories, tell the stories. They tell them to people who come and visit. They're very fluent in that. And they're like, this is who we are. We are a place of open spirit and open mind, and that is a lovely thing that they believe about themselves. I think it's more common that people don't really talk much about it and don't, they have, it's a regular community. I should make it clear. This is people with different kinds of jobs, different kinds of economic levels, different kinds of life issues that they live through like everybody else. And, and they're not waking up in the morning and go, so great to be here in this wonderful place where we know how to be good when it's hard to be good. I mean, they're regular people. That's for me is actually part of the most amazing thing is that, they just do it, right? They don't kind of count on doing it. They don't talk about it and make a big thing about it. They just know how to do it as second nature, right? So, but yeah, I mean, even quietly, there are stories that people tell, that point to the morality of the choice of, like, when someone harms you, to respond with goodness, right? And, again, this is an idiom that for some people might feel like a Christian idiom. I feel like it's an idiom that comes from many, many different religious sources, but nevertheless, it is this ability to just like I had a friend tell me a story about how I think it was her father or her grandfather, I think, there was, he had his property had a little river. And I don't know if there are any farmers among you. I only started knowing about farms in Russia, but like a neighbor had a cow and would let the cow like go to the bathroom in the river, right? So it's not nice. It's not nice to do. But getting the lesson about how not to respond in anger and vitriol to this thing, right? And just the quietest like stories like that. So, yeah. And I mean, there really are, the thing is a beautiful thing. I do love the fact that they, whatever kind of private story they have with themselves about the ancestors, they most often kind of keep that to themselves. So.
Thank you. Well, maybe now we want to close with a song.
Oh, okay. Okay. I had to, maybe a French one?
Sure, that sounds appropriate, Maggie. Thank you.
Well, or there's okay, I'll just do the French. It's a French and Yiddish song. So this is a song from 1938. It was made famous in France. It's called J'attendrai, which means I will wait for you. So there are a lot of songs like this in that period. French friends of mine, they know this from their grandparents. It was probably one of the most famous songs of that period. So I'm going to do one verse in French, and I think maybe the caption person has the French, but then I'm going to end it in a Yiddish version that was collected actually in Auschwitz. J'attendrai le jour et la nuit, j'attendrai toujours ton retour. J'attendrai car l'oiseau qui s'enfuit vient chercher l'oubli dans son nid. Le temps passe et court en battant tristement dans mon cœur si lourd. Et pourtant j'attendrai ton retour. Les fleurs plissent, les feux s'éteignent, l'ombre se glisse dans le jardin. L'horloge tisse, les sons très là, je crois entendre ton cœur. Devant ma porte, des bruits lointains, guettant ma porte, j'écoute en vain. Hélas, plus rien ne vient. Gedenk nach dir, betog und benacht, holam ich von dir, komm zu mir. Gedenk wenn ich seh, Blumen blühen, wenn schmeckt der Biss, kleine Vögel fliegen, herum der Nest. Es läuft die Zeit blitzschnell, mein Gedank voll mit Bank und mein Träum nachher. Herr mich, du komm zu mir, ich denk nach dir. Herr mich, du komm zu mir, ich denk nach dir.
Thank you, Maggie. I'm going to turn it back over to Amy, who I think is going to bid us all adieu.
Maggie, I want to thank you so much for such a wonderful presentation. The word I keep seeing over and over again in the chat and the Q&A is beautiful.
Thank you.
This is something that I think we all needed for our souls today. So I appreciate you and thank you for bearing with us through our tech difficulties, right? we persisted.
Nevertheless.
I want to thank our wonderful audience for their fabulous questions. We're sorry we could not get to all of them. I'm sure we could probably forward some to Maggie. And please, if you haven't had a chance to read her wonderful book, I recommend it, and your families will love it as well. Maggie, thank you for a very, very wonderful web lecture, and we hope to see you again in person sometime.
I would love that. I'm honored. Thank you so much for the invitation and all the work and bearing with my technical issues and letting me sing a little bit. And thank you to all of you out there. I feel you there. So hopefully in person another time soon.
Again.
Okay.
Goodbye,
Bye.
everyone.
Bye.
Have a good evening. Thank you all.
Okay, bye.